Jonathan Roumie sat across from the interviewer, his gaze steady but with a hint of something deeper in his eyes, something he had yet to reveal. The studio lights above bathed him in a soft glow, giving the entire room a quiet sense of anticipation. His reputation as the actor who brought Jesus to life in The Chosen was well known. But today, it wasn't just about the show. Today, Jonathan was about to open up about something far more profound, something that had shaken him to his core during a private meeting with Pope Robert Prevost. The audience could feel the tension in the air, as if they were about to witness a moment of rare honesty. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist, leaned forward slightly, the microphone between them capturing every word. "Jonathan," he began, his voice calm but with an underlying curiosity, "you've played Christ for years, and you've been inside the walls of the Vatican, walked alongside some of the highest figures in the church. Now with the world watching, everyone wants to know, what exactly happened when you met Pope Robert Prevost?" His half-smile suggested he was trying to keep the tone casual, but there was something in his eyes and knowing look that told Jonathan this wouldn't be a typical celebrity interview. The journalist already suspected this conversation was going to take an unexpected turn. Jonathan's lips parted as he prepared to speak, but for a moment he paused. His hands, which had been resting on the table, folded together, and his face grew serious. Well, to be honest, meeting Pope Robert wasn't just another encounter with a powerful figure. It was something far deeper, something I didn't expect when I walked into the room. Jonathan's tone was measured, each word carefully chosen. "I think anyone who meets a pope is going to expect something grand, something spiritual, right? But Pope Robert's approach to faith, his approach to leadership, was different. It was humbling, it was real, and it shook me in ways I can't easily explain." The interviewer's eyes widened ever so slightly, sensing the weight of Jonathan's words. "Humbling," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's an interesting word choice. What do you mean by that?" Jonathan leaned back in his chair slightly, but his eyes remained locked on the interviewer. When you're talking about someone who holds such a high position, you expect them to be surrounded by grandeur, by pomp and circumstance. But what struck me about Pope Robert was his simplicity. We didn't talk about the things you might think a pope would focus on: rituals, ceremonies, or dogma. No, it was about faith in its truest form, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. There was a soft murmur from the studio audience, and the interviewer didn't break eye contact. "So you're saying that despite the weight of the position, he came across as, for lack of a better word, human?" Jonathan nodded slowly, his face softened by the reflection of the memory. "Exactly. He spoke of humility, of serving others, of putting the needs of the poor and the disenfranchised ahead of anything else. He didn't ask for admiration. In fact, he seemed uncomfortable with it. His mission wasn't about gathering followers for his own sake. It was about guiding others to a greater understanding of God's love in the most genuine way possible." The interviewer scribbled something down in his notes, clearly processing Jonathan's words. The camera zoomed in slightly, catching the intensity of the moment. "And that changed you in some way?" he asked, almost as if he were digging deeper to find the core of what Jonathan was really trying to convey. Jonathan took a deep breath, leaning forward just enough to match the intensity of the question. "Yes, it absolutely did. I've always believed in faith, in service, but after meeting Pope Robert, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't about acting or playing a role anymore. It was about truly embodying the message of love, compassion, and humility that we see in Jesus. I had to step back and reevaluate what it means to live out those principles, not just for the cameras, not just for the audience, but in my own life." The interviewer nodded thoughtfully, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "It sounds like your encounter with Pope Robert wasn't just a conversation. It was a kind of spiritual awakening for you. But Jonathan, people are eager to know more. Was there something specific that Pope Robert said, something that revealed a truth about the church or about him that shocked you?" Jonathan's eyes flickered with a mix of contemplation and apprehension. He glanced around the room, as if the weight of what he was about to share required more than just his words. It required the right moment, the right tone. "I'll tell you this," Jonathan began, his voice quieter now, but still filled with conviction. "Pope Robert said something to me in private that I don't think I'll ever forget. He said, 'The church is not a building. It's the people within it who are called to serve.' If we forget that, we forget what it means to truly lead." And those words, in that moment, hit me like a ton of bricks. Jonathan paused, his gaze now fixed on the interviewer. It was a truth that shook me, because it made me realize how often the message gets lost in the politics of it all. The interview room felt still, almost reverent, as Jonathan's words hung in the air. The interviewer, caught off guard by the depth of the revelation, leaned forward. "That's an incredible statement," he said softly. "And I think our viewers will be just as shocked as I am. But Jonathan, what happens next? What do you think Pope Robert's leadership means for the future of the church? And how will this affect your own journey moving forward?" Jonathan let out a breath, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just shared. What happens next? "Well, I think Pope Robert's leadership is going to redefine what it means to be a spiritual leader. He's not looking for followers. He's looking for fellow servants, for those who are willing to step out of their comfort zones and truly live the gospel, not just preach it. And as for me, I think I've just begun to understand what it means to lead by example, to walk alongside others in humility, and that's something I plan to bring into my life from here on out." The interviewer's expression was one of respect, his eyes narrowing slightly in thought. "It seems like you're saying Pope Robert has already begun to lead by example, even in his short time as Pope. What does that mean for the church as a whole and for the people watching today?" Jonathan leaned in, his voice steady yet powerful. "It means that the church is on the brink of something revolutionary. People are looking for authenticity, for leaders who are genuine. Pope Robert is providing that. And as for the people watching, what they do with that truth, that's the real question. But if we're all willing to follow his lead, to embrace a life of service, then we'll be part of something that transcends anything we've seen in recent times." The studio fell into a deep silence as the weight of Jonathan's words resonated with everyone in the room. The audience waited with bated breath, knowing that what Jonathan had just shared was not just an interview, it was the beginning of something much larger. Jonathan shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on the table, the weight of the conversation pressing against him like the walls of the Vatican itself. The interviewer, now more serious than before, didn't break eye contact as he awaited the next revelation. Jonathan, sensing the gravity of what was coming, took a deep breath and leaned forward. He could feel the heat of the studio lights searing into him, but the most intense heat was the one inside, the truth he was about to reveal. It wasn't just a secret. It was something that would shake the foundation of the church and perhaps the world's view of Pope Robert Prevost. "You know," Jonathan started slowly, his voice now steady but tinged with an undercurrent of caution, "there's always more to a person than what you see on the surface. When people hear the name Pope Robert, they think of someone elevated, untouchable, someone cloaked in an aura of holiness." He paused, glancing down for a moment as if to collect his thoughts before continuing. "But there's a side to him, something darker, something about his past that isn't being talked about. I wasn't prepared for that when I first met him. I went in thinking this was going to be another typical meeting with a high-ranking figure in the church. But it wasn't." The interviewer leaned in slightly, sensing the tension in the room, his fingers tightening around the pen in his hand. "Darker? What do you mean by that, Jonathan? You've spoken highly of Pope Robert, and now you're suggesting there's something hidden. Something no one knows?" Jonathan exhaled, his eyes briefly closing as he recalled the conversation that had set everything in motion. "When I walked into that room with Pope Robert, I wasn't prepared to hear what he had to say. He didn't welcome me with a handshake or a sermon. He just stared at me for a long moment, like he was seeing through me. I've had moments with powerful people before, but this one was different. He asked me a question I didn't expect. He said, "Jonathan, what do you think the church really is? Is it the building, the robes, the rituals?" And I told him it was about faith, the message, the people. And he smiled, but it wasn't a smile of approval. It was more like he was waiting for me to understand something deeper. Jonathan stopped for a moment, his mind clearly replaying that exact moment. He told me something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He said, "The church has been built on lies, Jonathan, and I'm one of the few who knows the truth. But it's not something I can share openly, not yet. Not until the world is ready." The room grew quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the air conditioning. The interviewer's eyes widened, but he quickly regained his composure, not wanting to interrupt. "That's a serious statement, Jonathan. You're telling us that Pope Robert himself acknowledged that the church, in its current form, is built on lies? How does he explain that, and why is he so reluctant to speak the full truth?" Jonathan nodded, a slight frown creasing his brow. It was shocking to hear, especially coming from someone in his position. But Pope Robert explained it in a way that made sense. He said that for centuries, the church had become more of an institution, more about power, politics, and wealth than the true teachings of Christ. He wasn't speaking just about the Vatican, but about the whole structure of organized religion. It was almost like he was suggesting that a lot of the things we've come to accept as truth were manipulated for control. He didn't say all of it was wrong, but he made it clear that the message had been distorted. The interviewer leaned forward, his face a mixture of disbelief and intrigue. "So, are you suggesting that Pope Robert, as the head of the Catholic Church, might be attempting to dismantle or challenge some of its most sacred traditions?" Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. "It's not exactly that simple," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Pope Robert wasn't planning to tear down the church. It's more like he's trying to rebuild it. But he's trying to do it from the inside out. And that's where the real danger lies. People in high places don't want things to change, especially when it means giving up power. There are forces in the Vatican, in the church's leadership, who won't let that happen without a fight." The interviewer's eyes narrowed, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "You're talking about a potential rebellion within the church, Jonathan. What are the consequences of someone like Pope Robert attempting to expose these truths? What happens when you challenge something as deeply rooted as the Catholic Church?" Jonathan let out a deep breath, clearly weighing the implications of his next words. "It's dangerous, you know. Pope Robert is not naive. He knows the risks, but he's willing to face them because he believes it's the only way forward. There's a lot of power in the Vatican, and not just in the sense of influence over people. There's financial power, political power that stretches far beyond religious borders. If you start pulling at those threads, it can unravel everything. It's not just about faith anymore, it's about control, and some people will stop at nothing to maintain it." The interviewer was silent for a moment, taking in the magnitude of what Jonathan had just shared. The audience, too, sat still, as though they were afraid to move, afraid that any sound would disrupt the gravity of the moment. "So, you're saying Pope Robert is challenging more than just the status quo?" the interviewer said softly, his voice almost reverential. "He's going after something much deeper." Jonathan nodded, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Yes, and that's why what he's doing is so important. He's risking everything, his reputation, his position, his life to reveal these truths. It's not just about him or the church. It's about the future of how we view faith itself. The world is changing, and Pope Robert believes the church has to change with it, or else it will be left behind. And that, I think, is what makes him so different from anyone who's come before him." The interviewer leaned back, a mix of admiration and wariness in his eyes. "I can see why this is such a significant moment, Jonathan. And I think it's clear to everyone watching that Pope Robert is far from being the typical figurehead. But with everything at stake, what happens next? What do you think the future holds for Pope Robert, for the Church, and for those of us watching this all unfold? Jonathan's expression softened, a subtle hint of optimism entering his eyes. What happens next? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But I think what's clear is that Pope Robert is going to push the Church to evolve. And no matter what happens, it's going to change the way we think about religion, about leadership, and about truth. His journey isn't over yet, he's just getting started. The studio grew even quieter as Jonathan finished speaking, the weight of his words settling heavily in the air. The interviewer, though still holding his composure, seemed to be struggling to digest everything Jonathan had just revealed. He took a slow breath, staring at Jonathan as if trying to piece together the fragments of the story that had just been shared. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and even the audience watching from behind the cameras felt it. The entire world, it seemed, was now waiting to hear what would happen next. You've painted a picture of Pope Robert as someone who isn't just a figurehead, but a man with an agenda, the interviewer said, his voice calm but undeniably filled with intensity. Someone who isn't afraid to shake the very foundations of the Church. But with the power structures in place, with the weight of centuries of tradition backing the Vatican, do you really think he can succeed? Can he change anything at all, or is this just the beginning of something much bigger? What happens to him if the Vatican doesn't allow these truths to come to light? Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes focused and resolute, as though he was speaking not just to the interviewer, but to the world itself. Pope Robert's success isn't going to be defined by what happens today or even tomorrow. This isn't about immediate change. It's about laying the groundwork for a new way of thinking, one that could take years to fully manifest. The Vatican, the Church, the entire world has been conditioned to see things a certain way for so long. And if you challenge that, there are going to be consequences. It's not just about ideology. It's about disrupting a system that has held power for generations. The truth, as Pope Robert sees it, could be a weapon, but it's also a light. And right now, people in positions of authority are terrified of what might happen if that light shines too brightly. The interviewer absorbed every word, nodding slowly, but still skeptical. So you're saying Pope Robert is playing a long game? A game that could take years, decades even, before the full effects are felt. But Jonathan, what does that mean for the Church in the short term? Can the Vatican afford to have its leader, its Pope, speak out so openly against its own core structures? What's at stake for him personally, for the institution itself? Jonathan looked down at his hands for a moment, as though considering the gravity of the question. What's at stake for Pope Robert is his very life, his position, his place within the Vatican. He knows the risks, but this isn't about him, not entirely. It's about the future of the Church. If Pope Robert succeeds, if the truths he's trying to expose come to light, it could change everything. The Vatican might no longer be a place of power and influence, but a place of humility, of true faith and service. It could be the beginning of something much bigger, something that ripples out into the world and forces people to rethink their relationship with faith and the institutions that claim to represent it. The interviewer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the enormity of the conversation slowly sinking in. So you believe that Pope Robert's mission, whatever it is, will not just affect the Church, but the entire world. That's a bold statement. Do you really think people will be willing to embrace this change? Will they be ready to hear the truth, especially when it comes from someone they've looked up to for so long? Jonathan nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It's not going to be easy, and it's certainly not going to happen overnight, but change never comes without resistance. We're in a world right now where people are questioning everything: institutions, leaders, even their own beliefs. Pope Robert is just one voice in a much larger conversation, but it's a voice that can't be ignored. He's challenging the very core of what people think they know about faith, about power, about the role of religion in society. And while many will fight against it, many others will see it as the beginning of something new, something better. The interviewer leaned back, clearly processing the weight of what Jonathan was saying. His mind was working in overdrive, trying to piece together the long-term implications of such a revelation. This all sounds incredibly risky. For Pope Robert, for the Church, and even for you, Jonathan. I can't help but wonder, what's your role in all of this? Why are you the one revealing this? And what does it mean for your own career, your own relationship with the Church? Jonathan's gaze sharpened, his expression growing more serious. My role? I'm not here to be a martyr or a savior. I'm just a man who has spent years playing Christ on screen, trying to understand what faith truly means, trying to connect with something larger than myself. When Pope Robert spoke to me, it wasn't just about the Church or the Vatican. It was about the kind of faith we practice, the kind of world we want to build. I'm here because I believe in that change. I believe in what he's trying to do. This isn't just about being famous or making headlines. It's about speaking truth to power, no matter the cost. The interviewer paused for a moment, taking all of this in, his mind now racing with the ramifications of the story Jonathan had just shared. So this isn't just a fight for Pope Robert's soul or for the future of the Church. It's a fight for the soul of the world itself. Jonathan's face softened, his voice quieter now, almost reflective. Exactly. This is bigger than the Vatican. This is about the future of faith in the world. It's about whether people will choose to follow the truth, no matter where it leads them, or if they'll remain in the shadows, clinging to the comfort of the lies they've been told for centuries. The interviewer nodded, his tone shifting. Jonathan, this is one of the most significant conversations we've had on this stage. The implications of what you've shared are profound. But, as with anything this important, the question remains, what happens next? What does the future hold for Pope Robert, for the Church, and for the world? Jonathan met his gaze, his eyes steady and unwavering. What happens next? I can't predict the future. But I know this. Pope Robert isn't backing down. He's committed to seeing this through, no matter the cost. And as for the world, well, it's about to change in ways most people can't even imagine. The truth is coming, whether people are ready for it or not. As Jonathan's words echoed in the studio, the weight of the moment seemed to settle in. The world was listening, waiting for the next chapter in this unfolding story. The silence between Jonathan and the interviewer was thick, almost suffocating. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next piece of the story to unfold. The interviewer sat back, visibly processing what had just been revealed. There was a flicker of disbelief in his eyes, but something else was there too, a growing sense of realization that this wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was something far deeper, far more consequential. Jonathan, the interviewer began, his voice calm but tinged with a mix of awe and disbelief. You've painted an incredibly vivid picture of Pope Robert. And the way you describe him, this willingness to challenge the very foundations of the Vatican, to tear down centuries of tradition, is nothing short of revolutionary. But here's the thing, and I need you to be honest with me. Do you really think he can survive this? The Vatican has always been a place of power, of control. Are you telling me that someone like him, someone so bold, can just waltz in and change everything? Jonathan's gaze hardened, his tone more intense now, almost as if he were speaking from the depths of his own soul. Look, the Vatican is not some untouchable fortress. It's a system, a bureaucracy, yes, but it's made of people. People who are just as vulnerable to change, to cracks in the facade, as anyone else. Pope Robert knows the risks, but that's what makes him different. He's not afraid. In fact, he embraces the challenge. The Vatican might think it's untouchable, but that's only because no one's been bold enough to question it, until now. And Pope Robert is more than just a figurehead. He's a man on a mission, and he's not backing down. The interviewer sat forward, clearly intrigued but still cautious. But Jonathan, there's a reality to all of this, isn't there? We can talk about change, about revolution, but the Vatican is more than just an institution. It's a global powerhouse. There are billions of people who follow it, billions of dollars, influence, and power. You really think Pope Robert can take all of that on and emerge victorious? Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his voice steady but unwavering. I don't think he's looking for victory in the way you might think. This isn't a battle of power, it's a battle of truth. Pope Robert knows the truth is more dangerous to the Church than any weapon or army could ever be. The Vatican might be a global powerhouse, but power like that is built on lies, on secrets. What Pope Robert is doing is exposing those lies, tearing down the walls that have been built around the truth for centuries. And once that truth is out there, there's no going back. The tension in the room grew heavier with every passing second. The interviewer paused, then leaned in, his voice tinged with urgency. So you're saying that this could be the end of the Vatican as we know it? That Pope Robert, with his willingness to challenge the system, could bring down an institution that stood for thousands of years? Jonathan met his gaze directly, his eyes never wavering. Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. The Church, as it stands, is a relic of the past. It's a place of corruption, manipulation, and fear. Pope Robert's mission isn't just about reforming it, it's about dismantling everything people think they know about it. He's forcing the Church to confront its darkest truths, and once those truths come to light, there's no way to put them back in the shadows. The interviewer blinked, clearly stunned by the depth of Jonathan's conviction. But Jonathan, you're not just talking about changing the way the Vatican operates. You're talking about tearing down an entire belief system. A system that's been in place for centuries. How do you think people, the faithful, will react to this? Jonathan's eyes darkened, his expression hardening as he spoke. People don't like their beliefs shaken. They don't like being told that the things they've placed their trust in, the institutions they've looked to for guidance, are flawed, or even corrupt. But that's the whole point. Pope Robert is trying to wake them up, to make them see that the faith they've been sold isn't real. It's a manipulation. And once people start waking up to that reality, they're going to be angry. They're going to be confused. But they'll also be free. This isn't about destroying faith. It's about rebuilding it from the ground up, free from the chains that have bound it for so long. The interviewer shook his head slowly, clearly struggling to grasp the magnitude of what Jonathan was saying. You make it sound like this is all part of some grand plan, but what if it's too much too soon? What if Pope Robert isn't prepared for the backlash? What if the forces within the Vatican and outside of it are too powerful for him to overcome? Jonathan's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something deep in his eyes, something that betrayed the weight of what he knew. What if they are? What if the forces against him are stronger than anything we can imagine? That's the reality Pope Robert is facing. He knows what's at stake, but he also knows that the only way forward is through that confrontation. If he succeeds, it will change everything. If he fails, the Church will keep its secrets, and the world will remain in the dark. The interviewer sat back in his chair, clearly stunned by the gravity of Jonathan's words. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. So Jonathan, the interviewer said, his voice softer now, almost reverential, if Pope Robert succeeds in this mission, what do you think the future will look like? What kind of world would we be living in if the Vatican is forced to change? Jonathan took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with conviction. The world will be different. The future will be different. It won't be an easy road, but it will be a road towards something more honest, more transparent. A world where faith is no longer manipulated for power, but is a true reflection of what it means to believe, to serve, and to love. A world where people can trust in the institutions they look to for guidance. It will be a world where the truth, no matter how painful, sets us free. The interviewer stared at him for a long moment, the weight of those words sinking in. The truth, it seemed, was something the world wasn't quite ready for, but it was coming, whether they liked it or not. The room remained eerily quiet, as if the weight of what had just been discussed hung thick in the air. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, eyes focused, as if he were preparing himself for the final moments of this intense conversation. The interviewer, for the first time in the entire interview, had no words. It was clear that what Jonathan had revealed about Pope Robert's mission and the potential seismic shifts in the Vatican had left him stunned. But after a long pause, the interviewer gathered his thoughts. "Jonathan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I have to ask this one final question. You've given us a glimpse into a future that seems unimaginable to most people. But after everything you've said, I need to know what happens now. If Pope Robert succeeds, what kind of world will we wake up to tomorrow? Will we be ready for the change?" Jonathan's gaze was unwavering, his face calm but full of a quiet intensity. He took a deep breath, as though considering the enormity of what was at stake. The world is never ready for change, not real change. It takes people to disrupt the status quo. It takes someone brave enough to stand up and say, "This is wrong. We can do better." Pope Robert is that person. And when he succeeds, and I believe he will, everything will change. It won't be an easy transition, but it will be a necessary one. The interviewer leaned forward, now clearly captivated, hanging on every word Jonathan said. "But what exactly does that change look like? How do you envision the Church evolving if this truth is exposed, if the Vatican's secrets are laid bare?" Jonathan didn't hesitate. "It's about returning to the roots of what faith should be, genuine, transparent, and grounded in service to humanity. No longer will faith be used as a tool for manipulation or control. The Church will open its doors to those who need it the most. It won't be about money or power. It will be about compassion, humility, and kindness. And it won't just be a change for the Vatican, it will ripple out into the world. People will demand more of their leaders, more of the systems they trust, and the foundations of global faith will shift." The interviewer was silent for a moment, then said, "That's a powerful vision, Jonathan. A vision that, frankly, sounds almost too good to be true. So tell me, do you believe Pope Robert has what it takes to overcome the opposition he's bound to face? He's going up against centuries of tradition, power, and influence. Do you think he can truly bring down the Vatican as we know it?" Jonathan's eyes seemed to gleam with quiet confidence as he spoke. Pope Robert isn't alone in this fight. Yes, he's going up against an enormous power structure, but he's not the first person to take on the Vatican's corruption. He's part of a larger movement, a movement of people who are sick of the lies, the secrets, and the abuse of power. People are waking up to the reality of what's been happening behind those walls. And Pope Robert's transparency is like a beacon for those who want change. The tides are turning. There was a long pause as the interviewer absorbed this, before he finally spoke again. But how does it all end? What's the legacy of Pope Robert's work if he succeeds? Will history remember him as a revolutionary, as the man who tore down centuries of history to rebuild a more honest church? Jonathan smiled, a look of quiet pride crossing his face. "I think history will remember him as a man of courage. A man who stood firm in the face of overwhelming opposition, who exposed the darkness within the Vatican, and who started the process of healing. His legacy won't be about power or fame. It will be about the lives he changed, the people he helped, and the truth he set free." The interviewer nodded slowly, as if finally beginning to understand the scope of what Jonathan was saying. But there was one more thing he needed to ask, something that had been weighing on his mind ever since the beginning of this conversation. "But Jonathan, if Pope Robert succeeds, what does that mean for you? For your role in all of this? How does it feel to be so closely linked to someone who is making history, changing the course of an entire institution?" Jonathan's face softened as he thought for a moment. "It's humbling. It's an honor to have been part of this journey, to have seen things from a perspective few people will ever experience. But at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's about the people who will benefit from this change. The millions of Catholics around the world who will finally see the Church for what it truly is, a place of refuge, of hope, not of secrets and lies. I'm just one person who had a role in bringing attention to this, but the real credit belongs to Pope Robert. He's the one doing the hard work. The interviewer seemed to take in Jonathan's words, his expression now a mixture of respect and awe. He took a moment before speaking again, his voice softer now, almost reverent. So this is the new future of the Church? A future where honesty and integrity are no longer optional? Where the Vatican becomes a beacon of truth and love? Jonathan nodded. Yes, and it starts with people like Pope Robert, people willing to take the first step, no matter how difficult or dangerous it may be. The world won't change overnight, but every revolution starts with one person standing up and saying, enough. And Pope Robert is that person. He's the one who will change the face of the Church, and ultimately, the world. The room fell into silence once more, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes after an epiphany, when all the pieces finally click into place. The interviewer sat back, eyes wide with newfound understanding, as if the conversation had revealed a truth he hadn't been prepared to hear. Finally, he spoke again, his voice soft, almost reverent. Thank you, Jonathan, for sharing this with us, for giving us a glimpse into a future we never thought possible. The world is changing, and now we know Pope Robert is at the forefront of that change. Jonathan smiled, his expression peaceful but filled with the knowledge that the battle was far from over. But he also knew that the journey had already begun, and the first steps had already been taken. Pope Robert had ignited a spark that would soon spread, lighting up the darkness and revealing the truth for all to see. And so, as the interview ended and the lights dimmed, the world outside continued to turn. But something had changed, something profound. The revelations of the day would not be easily forgotten. And as the dust settled, the world began to stir. Change was on the horizon, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the farthest corners of the earth. Pope Robert Prevost's mission was far from complete, but the truth was already in motion.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.